Okay, here we are. Awesome. So hello, welcome to this, LinkedIn Live. Today I'm extremely excited because we have Cesar Castro here. He is, an expert in strategic storytelling, and he has an amazing topic because, guys, that I have this job interview course, and I've never heard about using storytelling for job interviews. I mean, as such. So, Cesar, thank you so much for your time. I'm just going to open here so everyone can see you.
There you go. No,
There you go.
thank you, Gabby, for your invitation. I mean, this is a great opportunity to be able to talk with people and teach. I'm always open to teaching and obviously sharing with people the power that stories can have in their own personal and professional careers.
Absolutely. Okay. So, first of all, tell us about you. Like, why storytelling? Why? Why
Why
storytelling?
storytelling? Well, that's a good question. It's actually one of the most common questions that they ask me, especially when I go, because I work a lot with the corporate world. I train a lot of corporate leaders and how to tell better stories so they can communicate with more impact, with more emotion. And when I usually go in for like these meetings with the people in HR and everything, that the typical question is like why do you do this, and where did you learn to do this, and did you like study for this, did you get a certification? And my answer usually is, look, I've been preparing for this my whole life. And usually when I say that, they'll look at me kind of weird, like, what do you mean you preparing for this your whole life? And then I'll tell them a story, right? And the story that I usually tell is about my childhood, and about how when I was 6 years old, I was actually a really like timid and shy child. Like I was scared of people. I was scared to talk in public. I was scared to interact with people, and which is
What?
kind of weird because now I dedicate myself to
Yeah.
teaching people how to talk in public. And you would think that maybe you're born with that gift, and in my case I wasn't born with it. Okay.
Hmm.
um, and what happened was, when I was 6, my father decided to move to United States. Okay, he came to study here in the United States. And I mean, at first it was an adventure. We were happy we were going to a new country, meeting new
Yes.
people. But for me, the hardest thing about coming to the United States was I didn't speak English, like zero English, right? I didn't have any background when I was 6 in English. So when I got here,
Of course.
when I got here at first, my first few months were really, really difficult because I didn't understand people. And it's one of the most intimidating things when you have to like try to speak, and you don't know how to speak, or you can't
Yeah.
understand the people. It's horrible, right? So I was already very timid, very shy, very introverted. And that just took it like 10 times worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And you were scared, I suppose, because
and,
it's like you
and
don't understand anything.
Yeah, so like once I got here, again, I was 6, 7 years old at that time. I got here and I started school, and I remember that I the teacher, she put me right next to her desk so I could try to ask her questions every now and then. And literally, when I would get to class, I would just go and sit at my desk, and I would just look at the floor. And in my mind, the whole time I was thinking, please don't call on me. Please don't ask me questions. Please don't come say anything to me, because I didn't want to interact with people. I was scared to
Of
interact with
course.
people, right? And that was my first 3 months, just zero interaction, always just going to class and sitting and looking at the floor, and not
Yes.
participating much. And after 3 months, I was starting to understand a little bit. And I remember that one Monday morning, I got to class, and the teacher, she came up to me, and she always tried to speak a little bit of Spanish. She was learning a few words so she could communicate with me. So she'd be like, hola Cesar. And I was like, hello, teacher. And then she said something to me that literally just stopped my heart, because she said, Cesar, today, hoy, you storytell, you contar una historia. And I was like, I no understand. even, even though I knew what she was asking me, because every Monday morning, she would always pick a few kids to get up in front of the class and talk about something that they did on the weekend. Okay.
Okay.
And this was just part of the, like, what she was doing to try to get kids to feel comfortable,
Yes.
getting up in public. And she would always challenge the kids to try to tell a story. Okay. So I never thought she was going to ask me to do it because I didn't speak the language. But that day she asked me to do it.
Oh my
And
God.
I know, understand. So I just kind of sat down and I thought that was it. Like, she wasn't going to ask me anymore because I didn't understand. Right. So, she asked the first kid to get up. He tells a little story, talks about something, the second, the third. And I was like, okay, whew, she forgot about me. And then all of a sudden she says, Cesar,
Cesar.
it's your turn. And I remember, like, this is when I was 6 or 7, but I still remember as if it was yesterday. Right. Because right when she says my name and she says, it's your turn, my heart just starts racing, 1,000 miles per hour. My knees start shaking, and I get up and I walk towards the front of my class. And once I turn around and I see all my class, which was like 30 kids, I didn't know what to say. I was just like, and, just paused for a few seconds. And then all of a sudden I remembered a story, right? I remembered
Okay.
a very just simple story of something that I had done with my family, a few weeks before. And I tried to tell that story the best that I could, with my broken English, kind of Tarzan English. I tried to just tell a story. And I would love to tell you, Gavi, and the people that are listening, that, that day, the heavens opened and almost heard a voice that said, you're meant for this. I would love to tell you that, that day I told an amazing story, because that would have been, a great story, but that didn't happen. Actually, I just told a simple story. And then I went and sat down. And when I sat down, I put my face, right in my hand. And I was like, oh, this is horrible. You did a horrible job. No one understood what you said. What a crappy story you told. And after just a few seconds of beating myself up, I remember that I raised my view, and I started looking at all my classmates, and every single one of them was going like this. Every single one of them was doing this, a thumbs up, which, that's the universal sign. This means good job. This means, bien hecho, right? And that, to me, that was a before and after experience.
Great.
Because that
Oh
was
my
the first
God.
time, Gabby, that I can remember that I could really feel the power of a story. I really felt, what a story could do. And it wasn't even a good story. It was just me getting up and trying to tell a story. But I could really tell and feel at that moment, what a story could do to other
Yes.
people, and what it could do for me. And that was a before and after, because obviously after that, I started getting more confidence. Every Monday I would raise my hand and ask my if I could share a story. And I started getting so good at it, because I was practicing every week. I was, trying
Exactly.
to share stories, that after like 2 years, once I now had the language, I started competing. And every year they had a competition at my school, where they would pick in every class, like, the winner of storytelling. And then we'd get up in front of the whole school and tell a story. And I started competing and I started winning. And then they invited me when I was like 11 or 12 to participate in a national storytelling festival, the Timpanogos Storytelling Festival. And when I was 12
Great.
years old, I won that competition. So I became
Oh my God.
storyteller among school kids in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And that, to me, when I think about it now, I'm like, this is when I was 12, right?
Yes.
When I was 7, I was scared to get up and talk in front of my class. 5 years later, I'm in a stage, right? I'm on a stage in front of 5,000 people sharing a story. And that is the power that stories can have. And that, to me, I mean, changed everything about how I wanted to do, what I wanted to do. I didn't think
Of
at that
course.
moment that I would dedicate myself professionally to this, because I honestly thought that everyone knew how to tell stories, because when you tell stories as a child and you just learn how to do it as a kid, you kind of think that everyone else can do it. You don't think it's something special, because it's just something that you do.
Yes.
And when I studied psychology, and then I worked in the corporate world for a few years, and then I became an entrepreneur and started my own company. And to me, it was shocking once I started working in the corporate world, how bad managers were at communicating. Like,
Got it.
when I talk about communication, I mean, like public speaking, because a lot of what leaders do is present, and they have to persuade, and they have to motivate. And
Yes.
I would go to these presentations and these meetings with leaders, with big corporate, managers, and they were so boring. right? They were so just like, they would just read the screen with their numbers and stats. And I was like, there's got to be something else. Like I've always felt inspired by like leaders, Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela and Abraham Lincoln,
Thinkers. Yeah.
great communicators, right? Great
Yep.
communicators. And I started studying these great communicators, started reading the biographies and started watching videos. And what I found, Gabby, which to me was, it was, in a way it was connecting the dots, but also it was like that flash, that moment where like the light turns on in your head. What I found is that all great leaders, or at least the leaders that I was inspired by, were also great storytellers. Great
Okay.
leaders are great storytellers. They're not just great communicators. They're able to communicate by stories. They're able to get people excited and get people to just fall in love with the vision or the strategy.
Yes.
And I said, that's it. Like that is what is lacking. And I didn't see anyone doing it. Like I knew what was missing, but I also saw that no one was teaching leaders how to do it.
Yep.
And that is kind of when I connected the dots and I said, wait a minute, I know how to do it. I've been doing this ever since I was a child. I was doing it at my work. I was doing it as an entrepreneur, but I didn't have a methodology. I just did it. I just told stories
Exactly.
because it was what I did ever since I was a child.
Naturally.
So at the end, I created my own method, my strategic storytelling method. And I started trying it out for a few years with some of my clients. And it started working like really, really good. Like the leaders that I was working and teaching them storytelling, they were just becoming awesome leaders. The results were off the roof. Their teams were super engaged. They were generating change. And once I saw that over and over again, I said, I got to just focus on this. So about 3 or 4 years ago, I just decided, to just focus on becoming the strategic storytelling expert. And that is what I've done the last 3 years, is just train leaders and professionals, thousands of leaders and professionals, in how to better their communication and how to become more influential by using the power of stories.
I like that. Influential. So how does telling a story makes you influential? Like, what is it in stories that helps you influence other people?
It's emotion.
Okay.
Emotion. We when we talk about influence, right? Influence is the ability to take people where you want, but because they want to go with you. So I'm going to repeat this. I'm going to repeat
Yeah,
this because
I'm going
it's
to write it down too.
very important. Like when we talk about influence, it's about taking people where you want, because usually, like if we talk about leaders, right, you usually want to take your team or your organization somewhere, right? Hopefully it's a better place. But the key to being influential is being able to take people where you want, but because they want to go with you, right?
Great.
So influence is about getting people to want to follow you. Not to follow you because you're the authority, not to follow you because you're the manager. They want to follow you because they're captivated and they just they gravitate towards what you're communicating, right?
Okay.
So influence is the ability to go somewhere or take people somewhere because they want to go with you, right? And we as human beings, we do this through our communication, right? We persuade and we influence by the way we communicate. But it's not just about giving people information, because it's never been enough to just give people information. You have to be able to communicate information with emotion to be able to influence people's decisions and actions, right? So we talk about emotions. This is where most people kind of just like, it makes sense. What I'm saying to you is very,
absolutely.
like,
because I'm just
right?
thinking, I'm just thinking about the internet. It's like information is on internet. You can find anything. But what people are missing is that connection, because if you want to learn about storytelling, or if you want to prepare for a job interview, or if you want to learn about business English or whatever, cooking, you will find it on internet, right? For free.
Yeah, exactly.
But you need someone to guide you in the process, right? So that's when, like the influence is important. So that makes absolutely sense. So it's not about information only.
It's I mean, if it was just information, then like there's enough information today to practically like be good at anything. Like we wouldn't have, if people changed just based on information, then there would be no drug addicts, there would be no marital problems, there would be no self-esteem problems, because information, we already have that information. We have information in how to raise our kids with good self-esteem. We have information in how to have good relationships. We have information how to be good leaders. We have information on how to, for example, have a good job interview. We have all that information. But the key to be able to get people to buy in and to really change people with information is not just to give them information, but to give them information wrapped in emotion. Because what we remember and what we act upon is emotion, right? We as human beings, we are emotional beings, learning how to be logical and rational. We're not rational beings learning how to be emotional. Like, to me, it's whenever I have meetings with managers, I work again a lot with corporate leaders. A lot of times, like when a company hires me, they'll hire me through human resources, for example. And when I have the meeting with human resources, they'll be like, look, we want you to work with this manager, but he's super rational, very logical, and I just listen to him for a while. And they're like, you got to be very like he numbers. And I'm like, look, is he a human being? Yeah, he's a human being. Okay, then he's emotional. And they'll be like, what do you mean? Like the only thing, like we talk about rational and we talk about logical, it's just because we have language, right? And if you studied, for example, ingeniería comercial or business, or you studied math or IT or whatever, the only thing that means is that when you communicate, you're going to communicate in that language. But we make decisions based on our emotions. Okay, we make decisions, and very irrational decisions. Like when you walk into a meeting, right? The manager, even though he's a rational guy, he's making a decision whether he likes you or not, just based on how you look, just based on the tone of your voice, just based on your corporal, and that is irrational. I mean, there's no logical explanation to that. It's just that when we see someone, we feel things, right? And maybe someone right now that's listening, they're listening to me and they're like, I don't like this guy. I don't like his voice. I don't like his energy. And they'll just start rationalizing. Then they'll start rationalizing their decision of not liking me. And they'll try to use, like logical and rational language. Like, I don't like him because his tone of voice is 3 degrees higher than what it should be, or whatever it may be, right? They'll start trying to use their logical and rational way of thinking just to justify their emotional decision. So
I agree.
if we make decisions based on emotional and emotions, the only way that we can persuade and get people to change their decision is by touching their emotions, not their rationality, because rationality comes after we've made an emotional decision. So what people try to do to get others to change or persuade is they focus on rationality, but that's because they don't understand that the decision wasn't made in the rational part of the brain. The decision was made in the emotional part of the brain. So when you want to get people to change, right, and get people to, for example, buy into your vision, or you want to persuade someone in a job interview, you have to focus on the emotion, because that's where the decision is made. And then they'll use their rationality to justify the decision that they made. So why do I explain this to you? Because stories are the best and most powerful vehicle to the emotions. There is no communication tool that is more powerful to touch people's emotion than a good story. There isn't, and there never has been, and there never will be. That's why we tell stories. That's why we as human beings have been telling stories for over 100,000 years, because stories have become the best and most powerful way to pass on information from one generation to another. Because we remember stories. And why do we remember stories? Because stories are emotional. And when something is emotional, we remember it. We put it, we store it in our storage, our garage, our brain garage. There. That's why we remember, for example, our happiest moments or our saddest moments or our most difficult moments, but we don't remember the last meeting, slide number 26.
No, not at all.
Does it make sense?
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, great. This is like eye-opening. I'm going to watch the recording again. So what about job interviews? Why, or in the business context in general, why using storytelling in an office or in a meeting or in a job interview? How to do that?
Well, first, why use it? Because obviously,
Mm-hmm.
how to do it. There's methodology to telling good stories, and I actually share a lot of that content on my YouTube channel, on my free course that people can download and have access to, and that's like an introductory course where they can learn about the main steps of telling a good story and everything. But why do it? Because just as we were talking about before, the person who's interviewing you, if we're talking about a job interview, is also making a decision based on their emotion. Okay.
Okay.
Job interviews are not rational. Like I was explaining to you before that I worked with this like outsourcing company. It's called People and Partners, right? They asked me to go and give a keynote talk to their people, and they what they do is
Yes.
they help reinsert people back into the job place. So they teach them, they have job hunters and everything, and they teach them how to like go for a job interview. And what they were telling me, one of the job hunter people that was teaches them how to go for interviews and everything, she was saying, look, like when you get to a certain point, right, in the interview process, like think about the first decisions that they make, yes, are based on your curriculum, your CV, and where did you
Okay.
study and what's your experience. And that's a little bit more rational because they have that information. But like when
Mm-hmm.
they get to the last three candidates, right, when they get to the last three candidates and you go in for that job interview, right, she said we make our decision based on how the person makes us feel. So if we go into the job interview and the person is boring, they might have all like the qualifications, right? They've studied at the university, they have the master's degree, they have 10 years of experience, blah 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 blah. But they go into that meeting and they're boring, or they give the same prototypical answers,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't stand out. You see, they just like everyone
Awesome.
else. So when you want to stand out and you want to be different, you have to tell stories, because stories make you different. And one of the reasons that stories make you different is because nobody can tell your story. No one can tell your
Okay.
story. So when you want to differentiate yourself, like you can have three candidates and they've all kind of studied at the same university. They all have, a master's degree abroad. They've all kind of had the same experience in the corporate world. So when you go in for that job interview and they ask you, the typical job interview questions, you got three people, right? And you got two of them that give
Mm-hmm.
typical prototypical answers that they looked up on Google. And then
Yep.
you got one
Yep.
person who, you ask him about, tell me about, the hardest thing that you faced at work. And they'll tell you a story about that experience.
Yes.
That
Exactly.
person is going to stand out. That person is going to be
Okay.
memorable. And when you have three candidates and you got to decide which one, and they all
Rem-
kind of the same, you're going to
mm-hmm.
focus on the one that's generated emotion. You're going to focus on the one
Yes.
that you feel more attracted to. And you feel more attracted to people that tell stories, because we as human beings are hardwired to pay
Yes.
attention and gravitate towards stories. Does it
I
make sense?
agree. Yeah, absolutely. It's like they will remember, oh, I remember this guy who answered, with this story. And he, like, because when people are preparing for job interviews, they have this STAR method, which is situation, task, action, and results. But how to make it sound, like original, as a
Yeah.
story, and not like I did this and this is the result and this is what I got and la la la, like
Yeah, like
not
a like
so
a like a like a
structured.
bullet
Yeah,
point, like A, B, C, D.
list. Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing, Gabby, is that like we don't usually communicate that way. Like
Yeah,
usually when we're
exactly.
when we're with our friends and we're with our family, I always tell my clients, I'm like, look, when you go home, right, and you're with your kids or with your family, you don't pull out a PowerPoint presentation, right? Or
Absolutely.
you don't say, look, here's my checklist of things that I want to communicate. You don't do
Yep.
that. Why don't you do it? Because it's not natural for us. We don't
Mm-hmm.
communicate that way. We communicate through stories. So when you go home, right, and you talk to your kids or your wife, and maybe your wife or your loved one will say like, hey, how was your day? And you're like, oh, you're not gonna believe what happened to me today. Like I
Yes.
had a meeting today with my boss, and it was horrible because I walked into that meeting, and the first thing and we start telling stories naturally,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yes.
that's the way that we communicate and make sense of the world. The
Yes.
interesting thing that happens is that even though we communicate this way naturally, when we get like into the business world, or we get into a meeting, or we go into a job interview, we change, we become robots, right?
Yeah.
Because we're scared, because we're nervous. So now we start saying, so then they ask me like, tell me about you. I'm a business
Yes.
administrator, and I have 10 years of work, and blah, 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 blah. And you've never, like, you would never say that to your kids or your wife or your friends, right?
Never, ever.
Why? Because it just, it's stupid to do that, because it just makes no sense, because it's boring, because you don't sound natural, because you don't sound like a human being. But we do that when we go into a job interview. It's crazy. It's crazy. It's not
Yes.
logical, right? But
Yep.
we're scared. It's usually because we're scared, and because we just try to rely on things that we've seen other people do, and we just keep doing the
Mm-hmm.
thing, even though it doesn't work. We keep doing it because it's just the way that we've always done it.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. I totally agree. Of course, we do that because we're nervous and we're not prepared. So, one of the first things that we got to do when we are in this job interview process is prepare in advance,
Yeah.
right? How would you recommend people to prepare for a job interview if they want to use storytelling in job interviews?
Well,
What should they do? Uh-huh.
the first thing, like, usually you kind of know the questions that they're going to ask you, right? Like that
Yep.
has already been studied, and there are like the 5 or 6 typical questions that they're always going to ask you. So when you already know the questions that they're going to ask, you
Mm-hmm.
know, now you can build stories, um, answering those questions. For example,
Okay.
I already knew, because this is typical. Like, this isn't my first live, right? So I
Of
already knew
course.
that the first question that you were going to ask me, because it's the first question that most people ask me, is like, why storytelling? Like, why
Why?
did you go into that world of storytelling, right? So I already have prepared my story about my childhood and that experience when I went to school.
Mm-hmm.
That story that I told you, just so you
Mm-hmm.
know, it's not the first time I've told that story, right?
Okay.
I've told that story over 100 times, because it's a story that I prepared, like, proactively prepared to answer the
Yes.
question of, like, why did you get into this world of storytelling? How did you get
Mm-hmm.
into it? Because obviously it's so, like, different. Like, you don't find storytellers, like, just anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's so different that I know that one of the first questions that people ask out of intrigue is like, how did you get into this? Like, why did you start doing this? And
Mm-hmm.
is there like a career path to this, or can you study this? So since I know that that's going to be the first question that people usually ask, I already prepared a story
Got
about
it.
about the first time that I had that experience sharing a story, and how that kind of started everything, how that helped me to feel the power of stories, and led me to say, I want to help other people to have a similar experience. So if I was in a job interview, right, and you were to ask me, like, oh, well, I see here that you do storytelling, and why do you, tell me a little bit about that? How did you get into that? I would have told you the story. Yeah. But that story is something that I prepared, something that I
Mm-hmm.
practiced, I
Of
crafted,
course.
and I
Okay.
practiced it so many times that now when I tell it, it sounds natural. It sounds like I'm telling it the first time, like I'm just
That's
having
the
a
point.
conversation with you.
Yeah. I think that's why practicing and preparing is so important. Because then, if you don't prepare, your story will sound like, I'm Gabby, I have 10 years of experience, but it will sound the same, right? Because it won't
Exactly.
sound natural.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
And how does using stories make you, like, uh, influence people who are interviewing you? Like, how can you be of influence to the person who's interviewing you? They hire a manager, recruiter.
Well, stories, like, when you tell a good story, and this is an emphasis that I make, like, a good story, right? Because we all tell stories, but sometimes our stories are not that good. So you have to craft and build good stories, okay?
Okay,
And there is a structure to that, and there is kind of like a method that good stories
of
have that
course,
that I could share with you a little bit later on. But
absolutely.
when you communicate and you want to be an effective communicator, there are 3 characteristics to effective communicators. Okay, this is something
Okay,
that's been studied, and there's actually a study that came out like 5 years ago with the Harvard Business Review, and they talked about, like, what is effective communication, and what they, after studying like thousands of people, communicators, leaders, what they kind of just synthesize is that there are 3 characteristics to great effective communicators. Number one, they're simple, right? They
okay,
communicate in a way that's simple. They don't use sophisticated language. They don't use technical language. They are just very simple, and anyone can understand what they're saying. So that's characteristic number one of an effective communicator, is simplicity, right?
okay,
Number two is clarity. They communicate, and when you're listening to them, you know that there's an objective. Like they're not just talking and saying a bunch of stuff where at the end you're like, so what am I supposed to take from this? Like, what
Exactly.
is this about? Like those
What's the point?
people, and we've all been in meetings and with probably like managers or with people that just like talk and talk and talk. And we really don't know like
Mm-hmm.
where the heck are they going to with this, right?
Yeah.
So second characteristic of good, effective communicators is that they have clarity. Their communication is always
Okay.
trying to lead you somewhere. But
Okay.
third, and this to me is one of the most important characteristics of an effective communicator, is they generate emotion. They're
Got
emotional
it.
in their way of communicating. So look,
Okay.
simplicity, clarity, and emotions, right?
Okay.
So those three things are what make you an effective communicator. And when I say effective
Okay.
communicator, I mean like you're able to communicate and people vibrate with your communication. They understand
Yes.
what you're saying. They're captivated by what you're saying, and they gravitate. You know, right? They
Yes.
feel sucked in by your communication. Now, stories help you with all three,
Okay.
because
Got it.
story, usually when you tell a story, it's simple, right? You're going to
Mm-hmm.
tell a story in a simple, just you're not going to use sophisticated language to tell a story. Two, if you're being strategic with your story is going to have an objective. It's going to have clarity. It's not just I'm telling you this story because it's a story. I told you the story at the beginning because I was answering a
Mm-hmm.
question, right? And what I want you to understand at the end of the story is the power of stories, right? The power that stories can have. And that
Yes.
is the power that at the end led me to say, I want to dedicate my life to this because
Yes.
stories are powerful. So
Mm-hmm.
clarity, when I talk about strategic storytelling, which is what I teach my clients, strategic storytelling is how we use stories as a vehicle to be able to communicate our ideas or our messages in a way that generates change. Like I always
Okay.
tell my clients, strategic storytelling is for generating change. Like when you want to generate change in your audience, in your client, in your team, whatever, you need strategic storytelling. But understanding that strategic storytelling is when we use stories as vehicles to communicate an idea. Okay,
Awesome.
so that is
Okay.
that is the clarity part of it. Like there's always, when you're even crafting a story, there's
Mm-hmm.
always an idea that you want to communicate with your story. You know, what's the
Got it.
point of your story? That gives it
Okay.
clarity, right? And then the emotion part, stories, if you tell them correctly,
Mm-hmm.
they are immersed in emotions, because
Okay.
stories have characters, people, and that always generates emotion. Stories have conflict, have obstacles,
Mm-hmm.
challenges, and stories have solutions, which gives us inspiration and gives us that, oh, they overcame it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you understand the structure of stories, you understand that they have all these elements that are meant to generate emotions, right? That's why
Okay.
they have those elements. Because when you tell a story and you're able to generate emotion, now you make your message or your idea much more valuable and much more memorable.
Absolutely. Okay. Okay. So that's a lot. So what is, I mean, based on this, how do you know if your story is good, if you have a good story? So let's imagine that I have this situation, I have this job interview, or I have this situation at work, whatever, and I'm creating my story based on my experience. But how can I know if it is a good story? Maybe for me it is because it's what happened to me, but how can I know if it is a good story to tell for other people to listen to?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that we need to understand is, since we are hardwired to pay attention to stories, anytime we tell stories, it's going to be better than just not telling stories, right?
Okay.
Um, how do we make stories better? Obviously, there's method to making stories better, but it's important to understand that telling a story will always be better than not telling a story. Okay, because we are hardwired neurologically to pay attention to stories. Okay, now is there a way that I can assure that when you're like starting the storytelling crafting process, that you're crafting the right story? uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of difficult, because at the end a lot of it has to do with the audience, who you're communicating to. So if, for example, I'm communicating to young professionals, for example,
Okay.
and I tell you a story about an experience that I had when I was a young professional, when I was just starting out, that story is probably going to generate connection. That story is probably going to generate, resonance, because I'm telling you something, even though it's my story, in a way it's your story. And
Absolutely.
that is actually one of the best ways to guarantee that it's going to captivate your audience. If you're able to tell your story in a way that makes it feel like it's their story,
It resonates with them,
it
right?
resonates. Yeah, because
Okay.
look, we as human beings, I mean, we don't
Mm-hmm.
like to hear this, but we are very, just it's all about us. Like we are very narcissists as human beings, right? We live in our world. Like, think about it. Every day while you're walking
Mm-hmm.
down the street, or you're seeing the world through your own story, right? You're not thinking
Yes.
about other people's story. You're thinking about your story, and you're you're
Mm-hmm.
you're, you're always seeing yourself as the main character of your story. So one of the things that I tell my clients is that
Mm-hmm.
uh, you have to tell stories, right? And people want to listen to stories, but they don't want to listen to your story just because it's your story. They want to listen to your story because they want to hear their own story through yours. Does it
Okay.
make sense?
Yeah,
And this is a
absolutely.
this is a psychological principle. Like, this is how we as human beings, when you want to, for example, you want to generate connection with someone, or you want to find common ground with someone, what you
Yes.
look for is commonalities, right? So you're
Mm-hmm.
you're talking to someone and you're like, oh, that's very interesting. You know what, just like you, I have a child that's 10 years old. And when you do that, now the person is listening to you, but they're also thinking about their own child who's 10 years old.
Yes.
So this is an important principle to understand, that people don't want to listen to your story just because it's your story. They want to listen to your story if they can listen to their own story through yours. Okay?
Okay.
So when you understand that, when
Mm-hmm.
you start crafting or choosing a story, you have to know who your audience is, you know,
Okay.
and see if you can maybe think about an experience or a story that you've had that could be common to them, right? That could feel like it's common to them. I'll give you an example. Something that, like, people, a lot of people. I'm not a religious person, but I do obviously find value in, for example, how Jesus would tell parables, and he would always be telling stories,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Of
And he
course.
tells he tells stories about trees, and about the farmers, and you're like, those stories don't resonate with us, but at that time those stories resonated with the
Yes.
people, because he was talking
Absolutely.
about them. He was talking about their experiences, and people
Mm-hmm.
would gravitate and they'd listen to him because he would teach them parables, right? He would tell a
Mm-hmm.
personal story, or a story about someone similar to them, and then he would connect that to a
Yep.
principle or
Yep.
to a value. And that is what storytelling is all about. It's learning how to communicate a story, but also in a way that can communicate a point, that can
Yep.
leave something of value for the people. So it's not just a story because it's a good story. It's, I'm using this story, as a metaphor to communicate
Exactly.
a certain
Yeah.
principle.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense?
How? Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, before we jump into the job interview again, how often is it appropriate? I mean, how often should I tell stories? Because it's like sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm gonna share a story, and then should I do the same with, like every time I jump on Instagram or I jump on LinkedIn or I'm communicating with people? Is like, how often should we use story on a daily basis to communicate with our people, with our communities?
I don't know if there's like an exact number to it. What we do know is that around 70 to 80% of how we communicate is through
Okay.
stories, right? So we
Okay.
usually communicate through stories. We're not even aware of it. That's the thing. Like, when you're talking with someone and you're, for example, talking about somebody else, you're telling a story. Like, when you're like, oh,
Yep.
you won't believe what I saw Pepito doing the other day. You're telling a story. I mean,
Yep.
you're chismeando, like they say, but you're telling a story, right?
Yep.
Or when you're like, oh, you know what happened to me today, and oh, you're telling a story. So we're always telling stories. Now, if you're thinking about like how often should we use them in a presentation, or how often should we use them in like a formal interview, again, I don't think there's like a calculated mathematical number to this, but I
Okay.
do think that anytime you want to generate emotion, you should tell a story. Now, there are different kinds of stories. There are longer stories that, you could tell for 3-4 minutes. There are little anecdotes that you could tell for 30 seconds, stories that are a minute or minute and a half. So if I were going to a job interview, I would have a few like 1 minute to 2 minute stories, knowing the
Okay.
questions that they're going to ask me. For example, they'll probably ask me like, what is your biggest strength? What is your biggest weakness? Tell me about an experience that you had, in your last job where you were, challenged by something. They'll ask you those questions. So since you know the questions that they're going to ask, you can create little mini stories to
Okay.
answer those questions.
And now that you say that, I think it's even easier to answer those questions using a story. Because talking about our strengths and our weaknesses, it's not easy. But then if you share a story, it is, easier to communicate whatever you want to say. I
Yeah.
think it's, yeah.
For example, if you were to ask me about a weakness, right, or a
Mm-hmm.
strength, right,
Okay.
like usually that question about strengths, when we answer it's very like, my strength is, and it sounds kind of self-reference, right? So
Exactly.
when we understand stories and we understand the structure of a story will always have conflict, always needs to have conflict before the solution. So
Mm-hmm.
if you were asking me about my strength, instead of me coming out and be like, my strength is I'm a great public speaker or I'm a great communicator, I would be like, you know what? That's a that's a tough question. I think I do have a strength, but it's a strength because at one point in my life it was a weakness. And now I have your attention, right? Now you're like, huh?
Obviously.
And I'm like, you know what? When I was a child, I was very timid. I was very shy. And I was scared to actually talk with people. And I had this experience when I was 7 years old where I had to get in front of my class, right? I was scared to death because my teacher asked me to tell a story. And I got in front of my class and I was shaking. I was nervous. And my mind literally went blank for a few seconds. But then all of a sudden I remembered a story. And I told a story that day. And I went and sat down. And once I finally sat down and looked at my classmates, they were all going like this, right? And that to
Validating.
me, that was a life-changing experience because that was the day that I realized the impact and the power that it had if I was just brave enough to get up and start talking and communicating. So from that day on, I started getting up every chance I could. I started, getting up in front of my class and sharing a story or communicating. And later on at the university and later on in my jobs, and what was at one point a weakness, today
Mm-hmm.
is my strength. Today, I think I'm a good communicator, but not because I was born with it, but because I worked
Of
hard
course.
at it, thanks to that experience I had when I was 7. So I think my strength is communication.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. You're hired now. And the good thing now that I think, because that's strengths, and when you think about weaknesses, there's always a moral, at the end
Yeah,
of stories.
yeah,
And whenever we prepare a weakness, a question, an answer about our weaknesses, we have to emphasize the fact that we are working on it, or like what improving, that there's
yeah,
something positive. It's not only about being, I don't know, perfectionist. A lot of people say that, but
yeah,
anyways,
yeah,
like it's not only the weakness, it's what I'm doing about it. So if you tell a story, then at the end you can give this, like moral, and what you're working on, what you're doing about it.
yeah. And did you notice the difference? Because when I told the story at the beginning, I
Mm-hmm.
extended the story much more, right? I went into more details because it was the context to tell that story. Like you were just setting it up for me to tell that story, and we're doing a live where at the end I know I have
Mm-hmm.
5-6 minutes to answer a question because I can tell a story. In a job interview where I might only have 2 minutes to answer the question, did you see what I did? I synthesized the story. I just went to the key
Yes.
parts or the key moments,
Mm-hmm.
but I still told the story, but now in a format that I could tell it in a minute or a minute and a half. So
Yes,
it
and it
doesn't
was still
extend,
emotional.
and it
Mm-hmm.
was still emotional. Now it's emotional first because it has the structure, but also because of my tone of voice. Because we
Agreed.
express emotions through our pauses, through when we lower the volume and the speed,
Mm-hmm.
when we, for example, raise the volume and the speed. Usually we do that when we're excited, right? So you know
Mm-hmm.
what happened to me when I was a child, and we're excited. You know what
Yeah.
happened to me when I was a child? Now I'm sad. Now I'm drama.
Yes.
So we have to learn how to play with volume and speed and pauses, to be able to communicate our emotions through our voice. because that's what will really bring people in and help them to also not only listen to your story, but feel your story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Feel your story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Totally agree. I mean, obviously it's not easy, but once you get into the mood,
Yeah.
of sharing your experience, and if you really want them to know, because there's an intention, right? And if you really want them to know the way you felt or the experience that you had, then obviously it's, much easier
Yeah.
to express yourself in those terms.
What people have to understand is that communication, storytelling is part of communicating, right? But communication in general
Mm-hmm.
is an art, right? Good communicators are artists because what you're trying to do is generate emotion, and anything that generates emotion is considered art. That's why
Yeah.
music is art. That's why drawing is art, because it generates emotion, right? So when you communicate, and this is something that I realize that most people they don't see it this way, right? We
Okay.
communicate because it's just what we do, so we never see it as an art form.
Okay.
So when you don't see it as an art form, you just do it,
You
like,
don't care. You
just
don't
whatever.
care. Mm-hmm.
But when you see communication as art, and you see every opportunity to communicate, like in a presentation or even in this live, it's an opportunity to create art with what you're
Yeah.
saying. Then you start taking it seriously and you start seeing it differently, and you start realizing that to create beautiful art through communication, you have to play with your voice, you have to use your hands, you have to
Mm-hmm.
tell stories, because when you're communicating, you're creating art because you're
Yeah.
generating emotion in other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. I'm going to copy all this, because it's so interesting. And well, in my case, this is a game changer. I mean, I'm communicating all the time, with my community. So it's like you always need to figure out a way to make them feel and understand what you really want to say, like you really want to share. So this is, extremely helpful.
Great.
Now, thank you. So I don't know, is there anything else that you would like to share? And now that we're talking about, like your experience, which was amazing at the beginning, like you were learning English. I mean, you had to learn. So is there any recommendation or suggestion, I don't know, or story to share with these people? I mean, our listeners are English learners, and most of them are frustrated because it's like, oh my God, if I just could speak like they do, if I just could, like share my ideas and communicate as fluently as they do, I could, XYZ.
Yeah.
So what can you suggest to these people that are frustrated? Like,
Yeah. First you got to understand that frustration is part of learning, right? Because whenever we're learning something new,
mhm,
there's always that fear, there's always that insecurity because it's
yes.
something new, right? I actually remembered an experience that I had with my daughter when the whole pandemic started. We were locked down in our homes and everything. My daughter started learning how to ride her bike. Like we could go outside and at least ride around, the house. And one day in the morning, she says, "Dad, I want to ride my bike." And I was like, "Okay." My daughter at that time, she was like 4 years old, 4 or 5 years old. And she says, "I want to ride my bike." And I'm like, "Okay, yeah, let's go outside." And then she says, "But I want to take out those little wheels, the wheels that you put
Great.
aside, like the help you
Yeah.
so the bike doesn't tip over." She said, I want to ride my bike like a big girl. I don't want to use those wheels."
Okay.
And I was like, "Okay, sure, let's do it." Took the little wheels out. We went out to ride the bike, and she got on the bike, right? I'm trying to explain to her, like, "Look, baby, I'm not gonna drop you. Like, I'm gonna hold on to your seat, so you just pedal, and Daddy's gonna be here to help you." And she says, "Okay, okay, Papa, okay." And she starts like, pedaling. And every time she starts pedaling and she starts picking up speed, since it's the first time that she's doing it, she starts getting nervous, right? So like the bike starts shaking. I'm holding onto her seat, but she's still shaking. And whenever she started like shaking and losing balance, she would stop pedaling and put her foot on the floor.
Okay.
And I was like, "Hey," her name is Nicole. I'm like, "Nicole, come on, put your feet up. Just keep pedaling. I'm here for you." And she'd start pedaling again. And every time the bike would start, trembling and losing balance, she'd stop pedaling and put her foot on the floor. And she did this like 5 times in a row. So I finally stopped her and I said, "Look, baby, look, if every time you get scared, you put your foot on the floor, you're not going to learn how to ride your bike. So I'm going to hold on to you, but I need you to pedal hard. Like even when you're scared and you feel like you're going to tip over, I need you to pedal harder because it's going to help us to not tip over, right? And she just listened to me and she was like, okay, papa, okay. And she gets on her bike and she starts pedaling. And all of a sudden, like, she starts picking up speed, the bike starts shaking, and she starts pedaling even harder, and to the point where I had to let go of her because she was going off by herself. And she rode for about 5 seconds by herself, right? And
Great.
she realized that she was by herself. She kind of got scared again,
Of
and I
course.
grabbed her seat, and I'm like, "Baby, yeah, you did it, good job." And you know, I'm coming in to give her a little kiss, and when I'm moving in close to her face, I see that she has a little tear
Oh
in
God.
her
Of
eyes, and I'm
course.
like, "What happened? Are you okay?" And she just looked at me, Gabby. She looked at me and she said, I'm so happy because
Mm,
I was able to ride my bike like a big girl."
that's
And I
beautiful.
think about that experience because
Of
for
course.
most of us, learning how to do something new is like learning how to ride a bike, right?
Yes.
Whenever we get on, we get scared. And whenever we get scared, we tend to put our foot on the floor and stop progressing.
Yes.
So
Yes.
the key in anything, the key in becoming a good storyteller, the key in becoming a good communicator, the key in learning how to speak English is we have to keep pedaling, even when we're scared. We
Yes.
have to keep pedaling even when we feel like, maybe it's not working well, maybe my story
Mm-hmm.
is not good, maybe my accent is not right, maybe my words, but you got to keep pedaling because sooner or later you're going to start going off by yourself. And maybe what's going to happen to you, similar to what happened to my daughter, is at one point you're probably going to get emotional because you're going to realize that you were able to do it.
Yes.
Something that you thought was impossible, now you're being able to do it. So to be a good storyteller, to be a good English
Mm-hmm.
speaker, to be good at anything, you just have to get on the bike and you have to start
Mm-hmm.
pedaling until you get it. Until you get
Yes.
it. That is my
There,
that is my suggestion for everyone. Just keep
I,
pedaling.
I I love it. That validates because I suppose my community will be like again, but I always tell them like trust the process. Trust the process. It's not easy. Obviously, it's not, but you have to trust yourself and trust the process. Keep
Yeah.
pedaling, keep working, keep practicing. You don't see improvements, but if you keep on working, I mean, something will happen.
Yeah.
You know, whenever. I mean, you cannot expect it. Maybe you're not expecting it, but it will happen.
Yeah.
This is like the 1%, improvement thing. Like if you do the work little by little, I mean, there will be results. There's no way you're not going to improve if you're doing the work. You see?
Exactly. So being nervous and being scared is part of the process.
It's okay.
What you decide and what you have control over is if you keep pedaling or if you put your foot on the ground.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
When I tell this is what I would tell your community. Like, if you're scared to speak English, right? And it's normal. I'm not going to say don't be scared to speak English. Don't be scared to tell a story because that's normal. It happens to all of us. But don't put your foot down. Keep pedaling. Do it anyways. Oh, I got a meeting
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to have to speak English, but what if I don't say it right? Just do it. Just
Do
do it
it.
with the best that you can. Just pedal as hard as you can in that meeting. And I
Mm-hmm.
can guarantee you that when you leave that meeting, you're going to feel better for not putting your foot on the floor.
Yes.
And that's going to give you confidence and momentum to do it better the next time and do it
Yeah.
better the next time. And it's going to get
Yeah.
to the point where you're just going to be writing by yourself and you're going to be like, wow, I did it. But
Mm-hmm.
that I did it happens because you don't put your foot on the floor. You just keep
Yes.
pedaling.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, I'm going to cut this and I'm going to copy and I'm going to, like share everywhere because, I mean, yes, thank you.
No
Thank you.
problem.
Thank you. That's a validation, because that's, it is what it is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah,
And did you
now,
see did you see that I taught you the
yeah,
principle
I was going to
through
tell you about
stories?
that. You did it again. You did it again. You
I
told the
did it again.
story.
Now,
You did it again.
this story is not the first time I tell the story, right?
Of
This is a
course.
story that I've told many, many times. And I actually created this story because a lot of times, like at the end of my keynotes or at the end of my workshops, people are like, okay, now what do I have to keep doing? Like, how do I keep
Yes.
developing the skill? Right.
Yep.
So the typical answer is like, well, just got to practice. Like, you just got to start telling
Exactly.
stories,
Trust the
but,
process.
but that's not memorable. Just to
Yes,
tell
I
people like,
agree.
well, like the only way that you can get better at telling stories is by telling stories is not
Mm-hmm.
something that people are going to remember. But when you
Yep.
tell them the story of my daughter learning how to ride the bike, and now I connect that to you just got to stay on the bike and keep pedaling, which means keep
Mm-hmm.
practicing. Now it's memorable. Now they're going to remember it. And that's
Yeah.
what you need. You need people to remember things so that way they can apply things.
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Can I use your story every now and then?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Okay.
Of course.
With your name, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, what I love about this interview, well, everything, but is the fact that you're using your own stories to explain to us, and it is obvious, like the way you use story and how effective they are, you know. So I find that's amazing. That's great. That's great.
Thank you.
Excellent. That's why you're an expert, you know. That's why you're here, because you are the expert.
Well, this is something that I've dedicated thousands of hours to. It's not something that I've been doing just,
Of course.
for 10 hours or 20 hours, thousands of hours to being
Because you
able to do
continue
this.
pedaling,
Because just continue pedaling. So now I'm like, I'm riding, off terrain. Now I'm
Right.
riding, on the mountains and being able to do tricks with my bike. But that's because
Mm-hmm.
but I started just like everyone else. I started as a
Absolutely.
7-year-old kid, scared
Yes.
to say something in front of others. That's how I started.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and the reason why I share that with people is because a lot of times people see me now and they're like, oh, you must have a special
Thanks.
gift. You must have some
Yeah.
special ability. And I'm like, I started probably worse than you because I was panicked to talk to people. So I probably started worse than you. And I'm here now because I didn't get off the bike, because I just
Mm-hmm.
kept pedaling and pedaling and pedaling. And
Yeah.
before I knew it, I was being able to go off road, and now I'm able to tell stories out of, just off the cuff because I have them all in my head and because I've structured them and worked on them. So
Yes.
all the stories that I've told you today, even though they sound like I'm just, saying them for the first time and very conversational and natural, these are stories that I prepared. These are stories that I've practiced. And these are stories that then I've started telling and telling and telling. And every time I tell them, I perfect them a little bit more and get them a little bit better. So
Okay.
that way it becomes much more impactful when
Yes.
I tell the
Yeah.
story.
So, would you recommend us like writing a list of possible stories, or how would you recommend people to start with their stories? Like, but before you answer, I just want to tell people here or who are watching the replay that in the comments I just shared the link to your course, your
Yeah.
free course that I took, and it's awesome. So, because I took that course, I would like you to tell people like what are those tips to help them start with this storytelling. The course is amazing, guys, so just go there and I think you have to write your name and your email
Email.
address, and then you
Yeah.
get access to the platform, which is amazing too.
Yeah. The
So
course, just so people know, that used to be a paid course. It used to cost $100. And this year, I decided to make it just free. Um,
awesome.
First, because I had already been selling it for like 2 years, and I had a lot of students. But then I decided to just give it away because I wanted everyone, like, no, I don't want anyone to have an excuse to say like no one ever taught me this, or no one ever helped me with this. I mean, the
Right.
course is a free course, but it's a course that usually you would pay easily over $100 for, easily, because the content that's in that
Yes,
course, even though it's for starters, but it's enough content that is going to transform the way you tell stories, right?
I agree.
And
I validate
in
it.
the course, I talk about how to find stories, how to create stories, and I even give you some tips on how to tell stories. Um, but in when it comes to finding stories, like I think a simple thing, like I would just give you like there's obviously different like tools that you can use to find stories, but I think just something that where everyone can get started at is just like having a what I call a bitácora, like every
Great.
day, just remembering, like, this is something that I do. At the end of my day, I'll go over my day, right, in my mind. I'll go over like everything that
Mm-hmm.
happened during the day, And any experience that I've had that seems like a good story, like, and when I say seems like a good story, it's because it's an experience that has emotion. Like if something happened to me today that made me feel happy, or something happened that made me feel sad, or made me feel frustrated, or made me feel angry, all these experiences that we have in our day to day are possible stories.
Okay.
So what I'll do is I'll just kind of review my day, and I'll be like, oh, this is interesting, and then I'll just write it. I have on my phone, in my carpetas. I have a carpeta that says just inventario,
Okay.
right? Just like an
Okay.
inventory. So I'll remember things that happened during the day, and if there's one that I liked, I'll just write a quick summary of it. Now, I don't write out the story, just a quick summary, just in one paragraph. And then
Okay.
I'll always ask myself one question. This is the $1 million question. Okay. After I do the summary, I'll always ask, what did I learn from this experience? What did I
Okay.
learn from this? What did I learn from this? And you'll be amazed at the things that come out when you ask yourself the question of what did I learn? Because
Mm-hmm.
when you start doing that, then sometimes there's like obvious things that you learned, but then other times you start getting creative, and you're like, oh, from this experience I learned the importance of not giving up, or just
Okay.
and then you start doing these connections where you'll tell a story about your daughter riding a bike, but you can connect that to a transformational principle. Or
Exactly.
there's a story that I tell sometimes where I talk about my son, and I'm trying to give him a medication, and he doesn't want his medicine, and what did I have to do to give my son his medicine? And I'll share that story to talk about the importance of using stories when we want to communicate information. Okay.
Of
So
course.
it's just a metaphor, right? It's not literal. I mean, what is a story about
Mm-hmm.
you giving your son medication? What does that have to do with strategic storytelling? Like
Yes.
nothing. But
Yeah.
you can connect it. And if you connect to your personal stories, transformational principles, then that even adds more value to your story. And people
Yeah.
will be like, you know what? I've heard that so many times. I've heard that, you got to give good service, or, that you have to learn English, or that you have to be perseverant. I've heard that message so many times, but I've never heard it this way before.
This way.
Because I've never
Exactly.
heard it like through a story like this.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it click. That makes it novel. That
Yeah.
makes it something interesting. And that's what people will retain in their minds.
Yes.
And if you can get people to remember your message, you can get people to apply what you're trying to teach.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's extremely important. So, knowing the audience, I mean, knowing your audience is extremely important too, right? In my case, I teach non native English speakers. I'm a
Yep.
non native English speakers. So, I obviously have a lot of stories they would, relate to. So,
Yeah.
it's like I have to do my homework too and
Yeah, of
write
course.
those.
Of course. Look, to be a good storyteller,
Mhm.
okay, you first have to be a good story finder. Okay.
Great.
So
Okay.
people want the dessert. Like they're like, I want to tell good stories. I just want to be a
Yes.
great storyteller. And I'm always like, that's awesome. But you first have to become a good story finder,
Yeah.
because that's where the real work is done, when you're finding stories. That is not always the sexiest job, because it
Hmm.
requires, discipline, and requires, to think, and to think deep at times. But the better stories you find, the better storyteller you'll become.
Absolutely. Love it. And people will, and you will create this know, like, and trust factor. Like people get to know you, they get to like you, and then they trust you,
Exactly.
right? Because they know you've been there before, right? Awesome. I don't know, is there anything else that you would like to share with us before we go? I don't know. I truly, guys, recommend you to take the course. And you have a Facebook group. I'm on your Facebook group, right?
I mean, we have like 3,000 people in the group right now.
Strategic storytelling, right? On
It's
Facebook.
called it's called Comunidad de Storytelling
Uh-huh.
Estratégico. It's on Facebook.
Exactly.
Um, yeah, it's a community, like people that like storytelling. So every now and then I'll share some content in there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing a lot of stuff, so I haven't been focusing too much on the group lately. Just because I moved to the States a few months ago and been full with my clients and with studies and everything. But if you're in the group, you'll at
Yes.
least be the first to know when like new programs come out, new courses come
Yes.
out. And also if people ask questions in the group, I'll usually, once a week get in there and answer the questions.
Yeah.
So you got the Facebook group, you have my web page, my page, my you can look me up on the internet, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
if you like to listen, you have the podcast. The podcast is
Yes.
called Storytelling Estratégico. It's
Mm-hmm.
on Spotify, on iTunes, all the other like podcast platforms. But right now we have 42 episodes, right? Every episode I'll share little tips and little just applications of strategic storytelling. And if you like listening, and that's the great thing about podcasts, you can actually listen to it anywhere. I think the
Yes,
podcast
absolutely.
is a good way to go. We have over 100,000 downloads. It's grown a lot, and I really enjoy creating content for the podcast.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's an amazing way to tell stories,
Exactly.
through a
Exactly.
podcast. It's like, I mean, what better way? I'm
Yeah.
just going to share here in the comments. I'm sharing everything,
Awesome.
all links possible.
Great.
Awesome. Great, great, great. So yeah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much. I remember this, that you have the three do and don'ts to call people's. I mean, from the ones that I have heard, that I have listened to, this the three do's and don'ts to catch people's attention, right?
Hmm.
And you have the three E's. Well, that is in Spanish. To Gregory's story, right? So
Yeah.
those episodes, okay, I can recall those episodes, and that's amazing. So, guys, if you want to learn about storytelling in Spanish, then
Yeah, the
he's
podcast is
the
in Spanish.
go-to.
Está en
Yeah.
español el
Mm-hmm.
podcast. So for anyone that
Yeah.
wants to listen to it in their Spanish language, it's in Spanish. Most of my content is in Spanish, even though I speak
Mm-hmm.
English. I've focused in Latin America and my clients that I have there. Now that I'm here in the States, I have a plan later on to start creating more content in English. But for now, my focus is Latin America and my Latin American clients and companies that I work with.
That's amazing. And it's great. I mean, that we have this interview in English, because we have, I mean, in the community, there's people from Russia, there's people from Japan, there's people from India. So it's like, they
Awesome.
can understand the whole thing. So it has been amazing, really. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. It's really helpful. It's eye-opening, and I'm going to get a lot of extracts from this interview, because it's extremely valuable.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the invitation, Gabby. I'm happy to be able to talk with you and with your community, and hopefully, some of the things that I've shared today will help you to better your communication and improve your influence by using the power of stories.
Yeah, I saw that you did like a workshop or something on presentations, right? So later on, using storytelling in presentations, I think there's something on your website about it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to link to that too, because I mean, presentations are key.
Yeah, it's the
So,
thing is that I have, like, right now when you go to my webpage, it's like all the courses that I have, the workshops are for companies. So
oh,
those are
great.
the workshops that I do like
Okay.
in companies. But now next year, beginning of next year, I'm going to be launching an online course that is going to be called Storytelling Estratégico para
Mm-hmm.
hablar en público como un pro.
I'm in.
that's
Okay,
that's
I'm
that's
in. Just,
that's it's going to be in Spanish, but it's
okay,
focused on how to
perfect.
use strategic storytelling to be able to talk in public like a pro.
Awesome. I'm in. Okay, just send me
And
the link,
that's going to be an online course, and people are going to be
Great.
able to buy it, and then you're going to have access to it, lifetime
Absolutely.
access, and use it to be able to perfect your public speaking, your presentations, and learning how to use stories, so you can become a pro at public speaking.
Awesome. Thank you. I mean, just send me the waiting list and I'll be there. Okay,
Perfect.
now it just came up a question here quickly, like storytelling in Spanish, storytelling in English. So if the person is learning English and they're applying for a job interview or whatever, and they want to create stories, what would you recommend them? Like create a story in their minds in Spanish first, create it in English. What do you think it's
Yeah,
easier? How would you go around that?
I yeah, that's a good
That's
question.
that's
I
the
think
last
that
one, I promise.
Yeah, I think that you better. I think it'd be better for you, especially to connect more with the story, to probably start it out in your native language,
Mm-hmm.
and then translate it, But it's again, it's because of the emotional connection. Like when you connect emotionally to things, you're connecting in your native language. So
Mm-hmm.
I would probably suggest, if you're thinking of maybe using a story in your interview and it's going to be in English, first create the story in Spanish, and then
Perfect.
translate it to English,
Perfect.
and then just
Okay.
practice it obviously in English so you can use it in the interview.
Yes. Yeah, because I mean there's difference. There are many differences in the way we share emotions in Spanish and we share emotions in English. So it is interesting, to
Yeah.
work on that. Thank you. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I absolutely appreciate it. And I don't know, I hope to see you again, like next year in this course, because I'm interested in learning how to be a better, because I'm trusting the process, how to be a better storyteller. Okay.
Awesome. Great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Take care.
Thank you. Bye. Thank
Bye
you.
bye.